Hi, I'm Tom Sullivan, Vice President for Small Business Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And we recently learned from our quarterly index that we run with MetLife that 3 out of every 5 small business owners are more motivated to vote in this election than in 4 years ago. Now, small business is a big deal at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We represent about 3 million businesses. 96% of those businesses have fewer than 100 employees. And when we total all of our partnerships with 1,600 to 2,000 local and state chambers of commerce and about 500 membership associations, about 75% of that membership have fewer than 10 employees. So we take these findings from our quarterly index very seriously. And when we hear small businesses are so motivated to head to the polls this November, we're interested in probing into why this election is so important for small business. And that's why I'm especially pleased to be joined by my colleague, Ashlee Rich Stephenson. Ashlee?
Hi, Tom. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me today. I appreciate it very much. And for those of you viewing this segment, I'm the Chamber's Vice President and National Political Director, and I really appreciate the opportunity to highlight some of what my team is doing along the theme of why this election is so important to small business.
Well, Ashlee, before we dive right into the state-by-state, the play-by-play, the power struggle for national policy in Washington, D.C., let's learn a little bit about your background. What got you to the U.S. Chamber?
Thank you for that, Tom. So I'm a political pollster and a strategist. I've worked on campaigns at almost every level across the country and have been really blessed to do that, whether it's candidate campaigns, issue advocacy campaigns, or on behalf of corporate interests. Highlights of my career have been working at the Republican National Committee during the George W. Bush presidency. It was his second term. I have also worked on a number of presidential campaigns, including Mayor Giuliani's presidential race. I was the political director, the polling director on that campaign, and then worked with Governor Scott Walker when he recently ran for president in 2015 in the primary and was a part of his political team, particularly focused on the early state of Iowa, the first in the nation caucus. So I've been very lucky to have a wonderful career that I've enjoyed a great deal, and it's just couldn't be better than being at the U.S. Chamber. So tell me, Tom, what about you?
Well, you have an impressive background. This certainly is not your first election rodeo. For me, I'm originally from Boston. I moved down to Washington, D.C. to make a difference, really during a summer internship in law school. I came down after law school and never went back, much to my mom's chagrin. I think the highlights of my career were certainly starting the National Federation of Independent Businesses Legal Center, and then working for George W. Bush. So our tenures overlapped, but working for the president as a Senate-confirmed small advocate, I really think back about those times and have so many amazing memories that help me do my job right now. My entire career has been focused on helping small business. And so when there was an opening at the Chamber of Commerce, I jumped at the chance to join the team. And so, Ashlee, there's an election coming up.
There is, about 30 days, yes.
So how are you involved? How is the U.S. Chamber involved? I know we're really involved, but sometimes it's not clear how. Can you explain a little bit about the U.S. Chamber's involvement and in particular your team's work?
Sure. So there are about 3 major elements on our political team of what we execute during an election season to be very involved. And Tom, it's important to say right off the top, we don't get engaged in presidential politics. In our 108-year history, we haven't, and certainly don't plan to this year or going forward. We are very engaged in federal races, however, on the U.S. Senate side and for House. The first major effort that we execute every year is endorsing candidates for office who are simply going to be good for business. When it's all said and done this year, we'll have roughly over 200 candidates for House and Senate combined that we've endorsed. And when we endorse candidates, we have events for them. Of course, during this year, because of the global pandemic, most of those events have become virtual, but these are things we do like to execute in person to be helpful for them, because when the U.S. Chamber gets involved, it's a real stamp of the business community lining up behind he or she running for office. Second to that, we do have our U.S. Chamber PAC. It's a political PAC that allows us to give donations to campaigns. We use that as a tool to support those that we're endorsing. We also use it to financially assist members that we're working with. So it's a very powerful asset to have. A lot of trade associations and organizations have their own PACs across the country, and it's something that we're very proud of and a tool we're very diligent about by way of allocating those resources. Completely separate from our endorsement and our PAC activities, we have something that I run called the Voter Education Program. This is an effort where we execute issue advocacy campaigns, usually advertising, on issues that matter to the chamber, matter to our membership, and really matter to workers and families across the country. This year, we've been engaged in 7 major places that happen to have big U.S. Senate races happening in the backdrop. And through these issue advocacy campaigns, we talk about the biggest concerns, quite frankly, to small businesses. And a lot of that over the last several months, as we all know, has been pandemic relief, PPP funding, making it easier to allow those PPP funds to be forgiven by the federal government, and continuing to keep a focus on bigger picture items that are going to matter after November 3rd. That might be infrastructure, it might be drug prices, the list goes on. The chamber's engaged in over 300 issues. But when we run these advocacy campaigns, we're making sure we're talking about things that truly matter to small business and, again, people out across the country. So we're very involved, Tom, as you know and are hearing about now, and it's something we're very proud of and work aggressively on day in and day out.
Well, thank you. And I've actually seen some of these issue advocacy ads. And for those folks who are viewing right now, if you look on YouTube and you look for U.S. Chamber Action, you can see a lot of these issue advocacy ads that Ashlee was just talking about. Now, I personally think that the small business ads are the best, but I don't want to corner Ashlee in playing favorites right now. But Ashlee, you've seen several elections. You've been personally involved in several elections. What makes this election different? And I should say, from a small business perspective, we know from our MetLife and U.S. Chamber of Commerce Small Business Index survey what's the same. And the same is the economy. Every election, when we poll small businesses, the economy ranks the highest of issues of importance for probably pretty obvious reasons. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this segment, we see a higher motivation of small businesses getting to the polls this November compared to 4 years ago. 60% are more motivated. So Ashlee, what do you think is different in this election cycle?
Well, first, an interesting part of our priorities and strategic goals at the Chamber has been to rebuild what we call the governing middle. We all know, and we just saw it with the CARES Act a few short months ago, if you can't get people from both sides of the aisle to work together and be willing to negotiate in good faith, they're not going to get things done on behalf of the business community. So we very publicly set out saying we were going to work to rebuild the governing middle. And I'm proud of our efforts that we've done to make good on that in order to be able to grow those relationships, particularly, Tom, with many new members who just won in 2018, especially in the House, to be sure that we are able to have an effective dialogue with them, talking about concerns of the small business community. By way of bigger trends, and I'll start off by discussing intensity, as you brought it up, we are seeing intensity higher today in national public polls than where it was in the closing days of October in 2016, just 4 years ago. So what does that mean? Well, we've been preparing for a turnout tsunami. 2018, the recent off-year election or midterm election, was truly a 100-year flood, as some called it in the, the press and the news media. We know 2020 is going to be off the charts. And what's happened now is the expansion of absentee and early voting.
That's right.
All across the country because of the pandemic. There is a chance that more people actually vote before Election Day than all ballots cast in 2016. It's really incredible. And lastly, just in terms of intensity, the amount of money being spent in politics in 2020 is just record-breaking, beyond belief. Despite an economic downturn of the last several months, people are giving, whether it's in the small dollar side, regular people, small business owners, to major donor gifts. This is both sides of the aisle in politics. There's a real desire for those men and women to be elected that folks think, as you mentioned, from an economic perspective, are going to help get the country moving in the right direction.
Well, thank you. That actually gives me a lot of optimism. Anytime I hear, that more folks are going to vote and more folks are giving to people they want in office, it actually makes me feel really good, because I know small business owners care very deeply about who they elect to represent them in Congress. And the best part of my job, Ashlee, is well, in addition to getting to work with you, it's also being able to talk with small businesses almost every day. And I tend to be curious and ask a ton of questions. And right now, I generally ask, what are you thinking about when you're voting, either by mail or in person? And there's one thread that is consistent in the answers that I receive, and that is that need for certainty. And it certainly occurs to me that every human being on the planet needs certainty, but small business owners are being a little bit more particular and saying, I'm doing everything I can to survive. The people I elect, they need to say, here are the rules of the road. Here's what we expect going forward. And it seems like there's a growing frustration that Democrats and Republicans cannot come together and actually provide the certainty that small businesses are so desperate for, not only to get through the pandemic, but to plan on rebuilding and re-energizing post-pandemic. And so I'm curious if you're seeing that frustration translate into some of the surge of activity that you mentioned a few minutes ago.
Well, again, it's important to bring up the point, Tom, that we set out in 2020 from the U.S. Chamber's perspective, knowing that we had to rebuild the middle to allow us to be able to get things done for our members and everybody, all the business interests across the country that we're supportive of. That's why we set this strategic goal early. And it's extremely unfortunate, but in light of the pandemic and where we are with phase the potential next liability package, phase 4 pandemic package that could include liability reform, which I do want to mention as a top goal of the chamber that would protect small business. This just shows us how absolutely critical it is to have men and women in Congress who are willing to work together. And there is frustration, and we see it among voters. We see it particularly those who are upset about some candidates who put down programs we're supportive of, like the PPP, and then benefited from it personally. We've seen a handful of situations like that. That's always unfortunate and quite frankly hypocritical. And it's also why there's just this huge surge of people wanting to turn out, and the intensity. This is really a referendum election. It usually is when a president is up for his second term. The real question is who is going to be able to turn out enough people on their side at the end of the day. And I will say that as of today, intensity still is slightly more in favor of the president than it is for Vice President Biden at this particular point among his supporters. But on the flip side, the trust issue is almost right down the middle on the economy. The president today is net positive by about a couple of points. This is among all voters of being able to get things moving in the right direction again. But it's a very, very, very narrow lead at this particular point in time.
Well, Ashlee, thank you. And we'll get to the presidential election in a minute, because that really is drawing the most attention. And both President Trump and Vice President Biden are the top of the ticket for their parties. And so we'll get to the presidential in a minute. But first of all, on the building the middle, or building the governing center, as sometimes we refer to it, the numbers actually back that up as well. I keep referring to the MetLife and U.S. Chamber Small Business Index, and that index shows that 68% of small businesses want lawmakers to compromise in order to reach a deal, in order to do Congress's work and provide a pro-business environment for them to get past the pandemic and rebuild. I think we hear discussions about kind of that upward trajectory. Some folks call it a V-shaped curve. Other folks say that it's the top of a K-shaped curve. But no matter what you call it, there is this desire to have an upward trajectory. And in order to do that, small business owners back up what you said is a real driving mission for your team, and that is to build the governing center. But we've already touched on the presidential, and we'll dig in a little bit more deeply into that in a minute. But the control of the Senate is in balance now too, or the whole power of who controls the Senate. And I know you've devoted a lot of time and attention to that dynamic. Can you narrow in on a couple of Senate races and just explain how they're going and why they're so important in this election cycle?
Well, Tom, thank you for asking me about these individual Senate races. And let's go east to west, just to look at them that way in no particular order. Beginning with Maine, the U.S. Chamber has spent a lot of time looking at this race. We've been very pleased to award Senator Susan Collins a new Spirit of Enterprise Award earlier this year. She is the most bipartisan senator in the U.S. Senate, and that really matters, to get back to your point of concerns about the business community. This is a race that looks to be very tough. All spending records are being broken in the state. Senator Collins does have a tough opponent. It's the Speaker of the Maine House, Sarah Gideon. And when you look at the national public polling averages, Gideon has led by about 5 or 6 points over the last several weeks and months. That said, in very few surveys have we seen her get above the 50% threshold, meaning Gideon. We happen to believe internally that this is a toss-up race. It's even in the data that we're seeing. And what I would advise folks to pay attention to is what happens in Maine's 2nd congressional district. In Maine, the delegates for the Electoral College are awarded by CDs or at the congressional district level. They're broken up that way. The president won the 2nd congressional district by 10 points. We believe that that's where this race is going to be decided. It's the northern part of Maine. Today, the president is losing by about 2 or 3 points overall up there. Senator Collins continues to lead, but this is a perfect example of where a member or a candidate has to really communicate his or her bipartisan leadership skills, delivering for their constituents. And she's done just a fabulous job reminding her voters her constituents, how she was out ahead of things immediately when the pandemic began and truly led on the PPP plan that saved so many small businesses in the state. Moving beyond Maine, heading down south, there's a huge race, and in fact, the most expensive one in the country today in North Carolina. Senator Tom Tillis, who we historically have been and continue to be very supportive of, is up for his first re-election contest against a man named Cal Cunningham. This today is the race that has really yet to wholly develop despite all of the money that's flowing into the state. We've seen in surveys as of this week, around 8% of voters are undecided, all the way up to 14% in a public poll that came out last week. That's an extraordinarily high number of undecided voters at this particular point in the election cycle. On top of that, this is a must-win state for President Trump and his team. And there's also a huge gubernatorial race happening while all of this is going on as well. So what's challenging about North Carolina, particularly statewide, are the changing demographics and a significant increase in population in many of the suburbs. So it's not like you can run one message everywhere. There's a very diverse set of concerns across the board. I think this is a race that's going to be decided at the very last minute. And one note before I move on from North Carolina, I had mentioned absentee and early voting earlier in this discussion. This was the first state to kick off absentee voting almost at the very beginning of September. Several hundreds of thousands of ballots have already been returned there. So it's just very interesting from a political science perspective to watch this state and understand the political environment overall. Moving beyond North Carolina, going a little bit farther south is Georgia. We have two huge races there. We call them Georgia 1, which is Senator Perdue up for his first reelection contest, and then Georgia 2. This is a special seat that Senator Kelly Loeffler was appointed to at the end of last year to fill a term. Going back to Senator Perdue's race, Georgia has what's called a jungle system. So if the senator doesn't cross a 50% threshold of ballot support on election day, once everything is counted and tabulated, he will actually go to a runoff that will be held on January 5th. That's when it's scheduled for. In the last 6 national polls, public polls, he has led them all against his challenger, but he's not been over 50. So there's a chance that for those of us who haven't had enough of politics by November 3rd, all eyes could be on the balance of power in the Senate if this goes to a January 5th runoff. The special election race, the Georgia 2 seat, this is definitely going to go to January 5th because the general election day is actually the primary. Today, there are 3 candidates who are getting most of the ballot share in the polling we're seeing. Senator Loeffler, a Republican challenging her, Congressman Doug Collins, and then a Democratic candidate named Doug Warnock. The public polling has been all over the place. There was a survey last week where the 3 of them were tied. Another one this week where Warnock, the Democratic candidate, was up 8. On top of that, Loeffler's had a pretty consistent lead beyond these couple of polls bouncing around by about 2 or 3 points on average in the last few weeks. So again, all eyes are going to be on Atlanta and Georgia the second all of these votes are counted at the presidential, House, and Senate level after November 3rd, preparing for the 1, maybe 2 runoffs. Tough to know at this point. A number of other big races to point out. A huge focus for us has been Iowa, going straight out into the Midwest, where Senator Joni Ernst, who's been a fantastic leader for business and somebody that the chamber supported very much in 2014, is up for her first reelection contest. That looks to be even in all of the public polling that we're seeing and internal. This is a state that the president must win when you look at it through that lens. It's a challenging political environment as the agriculture community has been hit by a number of different issues over the last couple of years. And there were even some natural disasters late this summer that had a devastating effect on crops. On top of that, big issues that of course matter to business large and small is the Green New Deal. And that's something that the Democratic candidate has not come out against. And Senator Joni Ernst is solidly against that because of the devastating effects it would have across the country and of course on the agriculture community within that state. Beyond Iowa, heading south down to Arizona, Senator Martha McSally. She's finishing an appointed term, is up for a special. She ran in 2018 and narrowly lost to Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who I should note was awarded the Spirit of Enterprise. Sinema was from the U.S. Chamber and has been exceptional working across the aisle. McSally is in a very tough race with a gentleman named Mark Kelly, a former astronaut. Kelly has led her in fundraising and in public polling for the last several months, more than a year actually. He's raising the kind of numbers that look like a presidential campaign. That said, Senator McSally is an absolutely prolific fundraiser who has delivered for Arizonans. She did in the House. She's doing it again in the Senate. She's an exceptional leader, somebody we've been very supportive and ran issue advocacy spots to highlight some of her great work that did affect the small business community last year, the first one being on USMCA and another one about water rights as it relates to agriculture communities. So that's an interesting race to watch. And again, it's a presidential battleground. Arizona hasn't been a presidential battleground in several decades. It now is, going back to my point on North Carolina, just incredible change in demographics. Beyond that, huge contest in Colorado. Senator Cory Gardner up for his first re-election race. This is just a tough state for politics overall. It's purple, if not blue. The president is not expected by any stretch to win this state. Senator Gardner has to run and is running as an independent who's delivered for Coloradans. He runs just really incredible advertisements. I always tell everybody, if you want to go look for the best ads in the country, look to see what Senator Gardner has up because they're always interesting and really cut through the clutter to deliver his message about how much he's done for his constituents. Beyond that, Tom, there's a number of races we've been involved in. At the primary level, we were very supportive of Roger Marshall, who's now the nominee and going to be the next U.S. Senator from the great state of Kansas. Also, Bill Hagerty in Tennessee, very supportive of his primary race. He is going to win that seat. The best pickup opportunity for Republicans is in Alabama. Coach Tommy Tuberville is the nominee there, running against a Democratic senator named Doug Jones. Just based on the math alone, it's expected that Tuberville is going to pick up this seat. But again, to wrap, Republicans are solidly on defense. It's a challenging political environment across the map, no matter where you are or what congressional district you're running in. And a lot of these races, too, I would close by saying we're not going to know on election night. And same goes for the presidential race. So just with so much absentee and early voting going on, we know that a lot of these states are going to need more time to count their ballots. And it's something we're prepared for.
Ashlee, that's a lot. Take a deep breath because you covered the entire United States in less than 15 minutes, which is amazing. And you touched a little bit on how the president has polled, and then you referenced that to the possibility of election, of keeping a pro-business Republican Senate. But can you dig in a little bit more deeply about how the president affects the votes for the Senate? Because I know that the top of the ticket, Vice President Biden for the Democrats and President Trump for the Republicans, I know it affects the races, but I'm not quite sure how. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Sure, that's a great question, Tom. And of course, again, we don't get involved in presidential races, don't ever expect to. Sometimes we do talk about issues that's going on as it's important for the business community. But what's happening at the presidential race is the question in some of these Senate contests are split ticket voters, swing voters, how many of them are left. So when I talk about split ticket voters, this really matters in states like Maine and Colorado, where it's a more challenging political environment. The president's not expected to win statewide. So if you're running a Senate campaign, you need to find that small sliver or pocket of individuals who are willing to vote one way at the top of the ticket, then pull the lever for you or fill in the ballot for your name and cross party lines versus just straight ticket voting. And that's why some of those messages I brought up about delivering for your constituents or having a public policy vision that's going to get this country moving in the right direction are so critical. And if I could give one piece of advice to people running campaigns based on the research that we're seeing, and to mention the MetLife study, is how hungry voters are for solutions. They're always sick of the nasty back and forth that's normal in politics. We see it in the ads, but we're really at a tipping point in our country. And this is why rebuilding the middle is so important, that we've got to be able to get to the table and get things done, to give confidence back to those with purchasing power, those that run small businesses, those that someday may want to open their own, to know that we're going to get things going in the right direction again. And that's why the chamber plays just such a critical role in the political space, to highlight those issues.
Well, thank you. I'm going to let you take a little bit of a breath and kind of dive into what some of the policy expectations are going to be if President Trump gets a second term, or if Vice President Biden becomes president. And so while we're focused right now, we're focused almost entirely on COVID relief and small business relief or rescue or a stimulus package. Our small business index does give some insight into what small businesses are concerned about past COVID. So if you look past the top priority, which is the economy, the second priority that came up in our index was COVID-19. Number 3 is healthcare. And that is not surprising. Taxes and healthcare primarily switch at the number 1 and 2 priorities of concern for small businesses. And in the healthcare space, there is certainly a difference of policy positions. In a Trump second term, it's likely that you'll see President Trump continue to try to reform the Affordable Care Act. He's done that through a number of ways, and in particular, from a small business perspective, his proposal is to allow associations and local and state chambers of commerce to provide association health plans. Now, that's tied up in the courts, but we would expect that the president really kind of push for resolution any way that he can in a second term. When you look at Vice President Biden's approach to healthcare, does look like he wants an expansion, a further expansion of Medicare. Now, whether or not that further expansion leads to a completely government-led healthcare system, that's certainly where the Democratic Party would push him to go. But if the Senate stays Republican, it's unlikely that he would be able to shift that far. Another priority certainly is taxes. And it's safe to assume that if Vice President Biden becomes president, you would see a rollback of several of the provisions in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And from a small business perspective, they really have to listen closely into how the discussion of taxes relates to the individual rates. Something that was kind of overlooked as we approached the 2017 taxes and tax and jobs, in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, something that was overlooked a little bit was that the majority of small businesses pay taxes at the individual rates. So when Vice President Biden starts talking about rolling back part of that law, I think it's very important that we really listen closely into how he's going to treat individual tax rates. He says we're raising individual tax rates. That means for small businesses, they're going to see a tax hike. He talks about lowering individual tax rates, freeing up consumer spending. That means that we'll likely see lower rates for small businesses. From the president's perspective, I think he's going to continue to look at ways to free up capital using the tax code, certainly as one way to do so. And a lot depends on the control of the Senate for both Biden and Trump on whether or not they're able to achieve some of those goals. Now, on regulation, another really big point that has a divergence between Vice President Biden and President Trump. In a second term, very likely that President Trump will continue his approach to reducing red tape. It's something that this president has done more aggressively, really, than any president in recent history. He's very proud of that type of approach, and it's very different from Vice President Biden's approach. I think if Vice President Biden becomes president, then we will see an aggressive look at several deregulatory actions, and Vice President Biden's approach to strike those down. It's a little odd when you think about it, to deregulate a deregulatory action, but he will try to use the Congressional Review Act to reverse several red tape reduction measures that President Trump has put in place. Now, again, as Ashlee had pointed out, with the importance of the control of the Senate, in order for Vice President Biden to do that as a president, he would need the Senate to switch Democrat in order to reverse several deregulatory actions that had been accomplished by the Trump administration. So even when I talk about some kind of wonky policy areas for small business, it becomes very, very obvious that the control of Congress, and in particular in the Senate, is critically important on what one president or the other can accomplish, either in a second term or a first term. So enough about walking out on policy issues. Let's get back to what's going to happen in November, or as Ashlee had pointed out, perhaps January 5th. But Ashlee, could we single out a few House races and explain why they are so important from a small business perspective?
Yes, you bet. That's a fantastic question, Tom. And as a reminder, we engage in politics on both sides of the aisle. We're supportive of men and women who are going to come to the table and help small business. And to start with a race that we were involved in earlier this year, it was endorsing Congressman Henry Cuellar down in Texas 28. His seat is along the border, very southern Texas. And he was being challenged from a far left candidate. And Congressman Cuellar truly led on helping to get USMCA passed through the tremendous hoops that had to be jumped through to make that a reality. And I was delighted to travel to his district We held an endorsement event for him with a number of Federation partners, and we were very happy that he was successful on what was a tough primary day. It just so happened to overlap with the presidential primary day, and Bernie Sanders, who we all know is a far left candidate, actually happened to do well in his home district. So it shows you the power of the business community when we all stand together to support a candidate. Another one is Congressman Josh Gottheimer up in New Jersey's 5th Congressional District. Is not afraid to talk very publicly how he works across the aisle as a problem solver to get things done. We're supportive of Congressman Gottheimer. We are having an event for him next week and look forward to continue to working with him. On the Republican side of the aisle, just to pick a couple, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik in New York. She's been a true champion for small business, somebody we've worked very closely with, and is a fantastic ally who you know when you need to go and get something done and have a good conversation and identify a person who's able to work across the aisle because of the respect for her. She's someone we're very supportive of. And just to make note of a couple of challenger races and opens, because those are just always fun, Tom, and we don't know what's going to happen. There are 2 candidates in South Florida I'm personally really excited about that we're backing. The first is Maria Elvira Salazar. She's running in Florida's 27th Congressional District. It's the Miami seat. She's from Cuba. She's a former longtime reporter. She talks extensively about the negative ramifications of socialism, being a Cuban, and has the credibility to storytell that I believe is fascinating and somebody who would be very effective in Congress because of her support for free enterprise. And right next door to her is another gentleman we just announced our endorsement for this week, Mayor Carlos Jimenez, who, as we all know, Miami-Dade has been in the middle of issues because of this pandemic with soaring numbers and closing businesses. And he has truly led, as you should, as a bipartisan mayor does. And he's also now running for Congress in Florida's 26th congressional seat. And we're proud, happy to support him and hope that he wins on election day. A lot of this comes down to the political environment. That's an extremely narrow and small snapshot of where we're engaged on both sides of the aisle and are going to continue to be on election day and beyond.
Well, Ashlee, thank you. I had planned on closing with your prediction of when we would know the results, but I think you did a really good job of explaining that we'll see certainly an incredible amount of activity in November. Probably won't know the day after November 3rd, but soon thereafter. But for you to highlight the fact that in Georgia, the January 5th jungle election might determine the balance of power in the Senate, that's certainly something worth paying attention to. So thank you so much, Ashlee, for spending some time today and just walking us through the entire United States. I'm exhausted from the travel and really explaining about why this election is so important for small business. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.